It's the most wanted car of all time, the most notorious, the one that gets Porsche's panties in a twist, and it's the one that is still an icon of one of the most recognizable racing game franchises in the world. Today, I'm going to tell you about every version of the BMW M3 GTR, including ones you've never heard of. Hey y'all, I'm Tom, the Racing Joker, and welcome to another episode of Car Topics Explained. So what makes an E46 M3 race car a GTR? Is it the engine? The straight-cut geared transmission? Maybe it's the bespoke factory BMW Motorsport chassis? Or is it up to the fans to decide which cars are worthy of the GTR moniker? Well, before the M3 GTR we all know and love came to be, we have to talk about its predecessor, the E46 BMW M3 GT. This car would have had a very similar wide-body exterior to the GTR, but would have been powered by a racing version of the S54 B32, the engine you find in the road-going E46 M3. The racing version of this engine would have been called the P54 B32. In case you didn't know, racing variants of most BMW engines are designated with a P at the beginning, whereas M-badge cars have an S. I've had varying reports of the kind of power the 3.2-liter racing engine actually produced. I would be confident at saying at least over 400 horsepower at the crank. And don't get me wrong, this version of the car is cool. The engineering behind this car is no joke. But unfortunately, in a competitive space against something like Porsche, it simply was not enough. Despite BMW's best efforts in the 2000 American Le Mans series, that straight six was just not enough to keep up with Porsche's 911 race cars. But here's a fun little fact: if you ever have the opportunity to examine one of these cars, you'd find that the stamps on the chassis obviously do not say GTR, they will say GT, but we'll talk more about that later. Either way, BMW found this car's performance to be unacceptable. So they went back to the drawing board. And so now we move on to the 2001 BMW M3 GTR we have all come to love. They did away with the P54 B32 and dropped in a bespoke, prototyped racing engine known as the P60 B40. A 500 to 600 horsepower, 4-liter, flat-plane crank, fire-breathing V8 engine. One of the most desirable BMW engines ever made. In fact, probably the only one that could come close second to the S70 V12. So, the GTR. This car had the iconic square-shaped carbon fiber wide body we all know and love. Depending on what track and racing series, the car has been equipped with Hewland gearboxes, Hollingers, and even upper echelon X-Track transmissions. The iconic side exhaust systems are actually aftermarket, if you can even call it that, and were fitted to the cars by the racing teams Schnitzer and PTG. It was not originally included from the factory. To maintain smooth exhaust flow and not do a simple 90-degree exit right out the side skirt, the teams had to cut out and tunnel through large portions of the GTR chassis, which, thanks to the welded roll cage system, did not compromise the structural integrity of the cars. If you were to fit a genuine GTR race exhaust system to a street car, you would destroy the car's chassis integrity unless you fit a proper FIA-style welded roll cage. Of course, these cars also had the iconic BBS 594-595 model wheels. The car ran carbon metallic performance friction brakes. It had a carbon roof with a NACA duct in the center at, the kind of front area. Oh, and the plastic vents in the hood actually served a purpose and were for feeding the engine air. The exhaust system itself was Inconel and was insanely thin, which of course saved weight. The transmission in some versions of the GTR, if not all, had clutchless flat foot upshifting in lieu of not being able to run a sequential transmission in the 2001 American Le Mans Racing Series. I think if they had tried to do that, they would have been penalized, I think. The P60 GTR is what most people picture when someone says BMW M3 GTR, whether they know it or not. And the original GTR chassis even were noted as such on their stamps, with GTR being explicitly on there. But as we move on, I want you to keep a neat fact in mind. If you strip every official BMW Motorsport race car chassis down to the bare frame, the roll cage and a few other bits, you'll find they're all pretty much identical. The GTs, the GTRs, the VLNs, they're all pretty much the same despite whatever racing series you see them in, regardless of whatever engines, transmissions, exhaust systems you see them running with. Speaking of which, have you ever actually watched the original broadcast footage of the 2001 American Le Mans series? How closely did you watch? My favorite, even though you don't care, is the Laguna Seca race. But more importantly, how closely did you listen? Because you may or may not have noticed that not every M3 GTR on the track sounded the way you think it should have. You see, it goes like this. Every car in the Schnitzer GTR fleet was equipped with P60 B40s, the V8s. But not every PTG GTR was equipped with the V8. Some cars had the P54 inline 6. My best guess is they weren't given as many engines. Maybe they were only given an allowance of a handful of V8s, and that was it. One other interesting thing you may notice is that the PTG 2001 M3 GTRs have modified front bumpers. They improved upon the original factory design and got rid of the blocky corner sections to improve the aerodynamics of the car. Probably a minute difference, but in racing, minute differences matter. So, will the public ever be able to own a true BMW M3 GTR? After all, it is the most wanted car. Unfortunately, the best answer I can give you is not really. The P60 B40 is a prototype engine, and BMW Germany's original plan was to not even let the racing teams keep the engines once they were to be retired. They don't even want you to have spare parts in your possession, whether it be spark plugs, throttle bodies, pistons, manifolds, intakes, air boxes, whatever. The P60 B40 is their baby, and they don't really want to give it to anyone. Because even though they built a handful of road-going GTR P60 M3 street cars with the carbon fiber bumpers, the roof, the hood, etc., BMW has most, if not all of them, unless if there's like some secret ones floating around somewhere. Last I checked, there was like 3 left or something. Most of the GTR street cars have been disposed of, from what I gather. I'd be surprised if most of them even run. But let's talk about the road-going GTRs real quick. So of course, the M3 GTR street car is equipped with a very detuned P60 B40 engine. It's manual, probably the same manual transmission as the E39 M5 or the E46 M3 road cars, since the street GTR makes 100 pound-feet less torque than the S62 powered M5, so I doubt the gearbox would ever be close to being overloaded by the torque. It doesn't have the electronic infotainment screen, but does appear to have a radio, which is neat. Other elements of the interior that seem to be special are the bucket-style seats, the door sill plaques that say M3 GTR, and the trim throughout the car is a strange gray bubble texture of some kind. And the steering wheel is super simplified, with no buttons on it, and is adorned in red and blue stitching. The road-going version of the P60 B40 very closely resembles the S62 B50 in the GTR Street version's engine bay. You've got 2 much more standard-looking air boxes rather than the carbon fiber tubing that allows air to come into the engine through the hood vents. But let's move on and talk about the exterior now. The hood itself, inspired by the M3 GTR, is carbon fiber construction and only has 2 vents instead of 4 like on the race cars. I'm not sure why, but the inner vents are the only ones present on the street cars. The front and rear bumpers are narrow body versions of the ones you find on the race cars. Most notably, the rear bumper has a similar under tray design to the race car version, but has cutouts for the muffler tips, which actually would have been on the original GTR rear bumpers too, but they were modified to be flat and not have those cutouts because everyone wanted a fire-breathing side exhaust. And you know, if you have the option, fair enough. The roof is carbon fiber, but of course it lacks the giant triangular NACA duct that you see on the race cars, and the street versions are also fitted with a little spoiler as well. Man, what I would do to have one of these cars though. Could you imagine? It would be more desirable than having a true CSL, which is still like over $100 grand these days. I know this will surprise a lot of people, to say I would take a version of the E46 M3 over a McLaren F1, but I would totally take an M3 GTR over a McLaren F1. But unfortunately, I'd have to give BMW an offer on par with a Royal Fortune to even have them pay attention to me, to consider it, if at all. There's no guarantee, because I've heard whispers of 20 million plus euro offers being declined. Now let's talk about the end of the GTR's tenure in the American Le Mans series. The GTR spanked Porsche, secured a championship win, and then the rules got changed to the point BMW really didn't want to participate anymore, and after having thoroughly defeated Porsche once already as a manufacturer, I bet they were already satisfied. They just needed some payback. Everyone was sick of seeing Porsche win all the time. Probably got a little boring, and I doubt they felt the need to build more street cars that they didn't actually want to give to anybody. So the true P60 race cars were retired from American Le Mans series, but here's where things get messy, because PTG still needed to make money. Since they couldn't race with BMW in ALMS anymore, they had to build customer race cars. Well, BMW obviously was not going to let them sell P60 powered race cars. And I guess they didn't want to sell P54 inline 6 powered race cars either, because instead they came up with their own M3 GTR recipe. They'd use the S62B50 V8 from the E39 M5, and they designed a sleeker, more aerodynamic wide-body exterior than even the M3 GTR, the factory race cars. The PTG GTR looks very similar to the P60 GTR, save for a couple of details. The V8 is cross-plane, so it's going to sound a lot more like a muscle car. The wide body was much more smooth and rounded looking, and on some PTG GTRs, I've seen different design uprights for the wings as well. And despite using real BMW Motorsport E46 race chassis bodies, none of the stamps are likely to say GTR on them. I would be surprised if they said anything other than GT accompanied by a number. But it does give some historical validity to any of the replica M3 GTRs out there that happen to be using S62 V8s. Because while the E92 M3's S65 and the P65 flat-plane racing versions are closer to the P60, the S62 was actually used by PTG in that time period. So now we've talked about three versions of the M3 race cars: the GT with the P54, the GTR with the P60, and the PTG spec GTR with the S62 in the customer race cars. Ready for things to get even more confusing? Let's talk about the VLN cars. You've seen those insane videos of the M3 GTR on the Nürburgring, right? Well, obviously those cars are equipped with the P60 B40 and are dubbed BMW M3 GTRs. But the chassis stamps don't have to say that. Instead, they'll say something like VLN, despite the powertrain being the same. And you know what's really funny? You remember that BMW M3 GTR that was restored for the Rolex reunion? Well, the chassis code of that car is 006 GT, or GT006, however you want to say it. That chassis is not originally designated as a GTR, but it does have a fully operational P60 B40 in it. So I guess it doesn't really matter. But anyway, since the VLNs are so similar to the ALMS GTRs and I don't have a ton of information I'm actually allowed to share with you guys, I'd like to skip on over to the World Challenge car, or cars. You see, what you're looking at is a race car using the same chassis as a GTR, but instead uses a narrow body exterior. Every panel on this car is carbon fiber. The quarter panels, fenders, doors, bumpers, hood, roof, everything is light as a feather. To make it even more interesting, the car is powered by what I believe to be a stroked 3.4 liter P54 race engine with obviously the carbon fiber airbox. So to summarize, the car looks like a lowered M3 street car, has a GTR wing, a functional side exhaust, a roll cage, and a 450 horsepower stroked P54 naturally aspirated race engine with a carbon airbox that would make CSL owners sob in a corner out of envy. I don't hear many people talking about this car, and I have no idea why. It's a shame, because it's such a neat package. But I should say, that's not the first car the stroked P54 race engine was dropped into. It's actually a racing engine package designed by PTG. They were the ones stroking these things out to 3.4 liters and producing 450 or even 480 horsepower at the crank out of a naturally aspirated inline six. And so now, with that, we move on to the final M3 race car version. We'll call it the 2006 M3 GT2 because it doesn't really have an official or agreed upon name. That's just what the community seems to call it, though I could be wrong. I'm pretty sure the chassis of these cars said GT on them, though, but that's just me. I haven't gotten to examine any of these. By the time these cars were done, they were more PTG than factory BMW Motorsport. They had the same sleek, rounded, wide-body kit from before. They had the GTR side exhaust. Some seemed to even have BBS 594, 595 wheels, the GTR trunk spoiler, and most notably, the very powerful P54B32-4. That's the stroker motor. Unfortunately, while these cars sound amazing, you can't hear the carbon air boxes on them because the exhaust system was so efficiently loud, is the best way I can say it. The headers, though, are gorgeous and exorbitantly expensive. The number of bends and axes those bends curve at are super complex and, as far as I can tell, impossible to replicate. That said, you can buy them, but the EPA and the DOT might bust into your house and take your kneecaps if you try and put them on a street car. Or a race car at this point, actually, with the way things are going. I don't know for sure if these cars used BMW standalone ECUs or if they use Motec. The way I see it, it's probably one or the other. I'm willing to bet it was more likely to be a BMW system, but I can't say for sure. All I know is with the BMW system, BMW would be getting data from the car, but if they didn't want the data, they probably would have been running Motec of some kind. Just based on things I know about the some of the other race cars. And to think, they squeezed over 450 horsepower out of these things without a turbo or a supercharger. Imagine what they could have done with forced induction. Imagine if PTG started making turbo kits or supercharger kits. Man, I think they would have made something really cool. I think they knew these engines inside and out. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end because in 2006, as the E46 M3's tenure in motorsport came to an end, so did PTG's partnership with BMW, which is why in some photos you can see a goodbye sticker on the windshield of some of the PTG M3 GT2s. But if you want to watch a video about the most wanted version of the M3 GTR, then check out this video that has over 1.5 million views from a few years ago. I think you'll enjoy it.